and we are speaking today with Bishop Taylor, and we are going to be speaking on the isolation that we have all encompassed in our recent history. And I first of all would like to let you know that a team has brought this together. And the team who brought this together for our residents is Chaplain Rick Bryan, Chaplain Brian O'Rourke, Chaplain Celeste Stump, that is me, also Susan Brown, Biosci Administrator, and also Sharon Putris, Vice President of Strategic Growth and Business Development. So we will begin giving thanks for Bishop Taylor to be here. And thank you very much for your openness and for accepting our invitation. The coronavirus has had a significant impact on all of us, but in particular elder adults. And many who are having this physical isolation and social distancing, it's caused a rift in the spiritual foundation that has been stability and resilience for them. So for most of us, there has been nothing like what we're living right now. Our spiritual, religious, and non-religious, very diverse population has sought guidance to maintain and reestablish that resilience and find hope in living with the uncertainty. So again, thank you, Bishop Taylor. And I would see one of our major questions today that we will discuss is the challenges to the body, mind, and spirit during this time of pandemic. I have to learn to say that word properly. Could you share a little background about yourself first, Bishop Taylor? What you do and who you are in our Episcopal Diocese, and also what you spiritually have been doing before this isolation and now what you're doing.
Well, Deacon Celeste, first of all, thank you for welcoming me into the ECS circle. My thanks as well to Rick and Brian and Sharon and Susan and all who enabled us to have this time together. My name is John Harvey Taylor, and I am the 7th Diocesan Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles, which I think almost everyone in our ECS family of institutions knows is affiliated with ECS because of deep roots in the history of both institutions. We have churches, we're kind of like a small country with all of the diversity of a country socioeconomically and language-wise and in terms of ethnicity and other ways that people can be people. We go from the coast to the Colorado River, mountains, deserts, rural and farm communities, suburban communities. And we, like ECS, are using this time to rediscover our essential familyhood, which I think is part and parcel of the broader question you asked, Celeste, about the spiritual challenges that we all share together. This is a very important piece. Those who live in convalescent care in any kind of a setting, and I hate to generalize, but we're in the midst of a pandemic. And in California, 40% of those who've been lost to COVID-19 are people who live or work in convalescent care settings, are older siblings, not to generalize about anyone by age. I'm talking more about the conditions in which older people often find themselves in modern society, not kind of at home with the clan, as it would have been in, for instance, Jesus's time, but in institutional settings. It's just the reality of modern life and of post-World War II life, in particular in the United States. And it's not here to sort of critique this situation. It's a situation that we live with. And so speaking broadly about this cohort of our neighbors, the pandemic has fallen hard on their heads. It's fallen hard on black and brown heads as well, as we all know from the news, but also, if I may, on gray heads. And so it's something we have to be attentive to, again, as a family, so that whatever isolation unfairly comes to a certain cohort of our neighbors, we find a way to address that. So this isolation, however, is something which we're all experiencing. And Celeste asked about my walk. My wife, Kathy, and I were just talking about this morning. These are rough times. We are designed by the Creator. Excuse me in advance for using a faith argot. I know that we're all in various sort of conditions in relationship to institutional religion, and I know there are some who are probably listening who are not people of faith, who find their meaning richly in other ways. But the argot I use is generally an argot of kind of the Abrahamic religion. And for me, the important thing to remember in the midst of this isolating thing I'm going to do a little bit of Bible study here, so bear with me. The thing about Abrahamic people, so when we say that, obviously we mean Jews, Christians, and Muslims. They all share aspects of the same canon. And our central organizing metaphors are wilderness and exile. The people of God in the time of Moses were in exile. They were on a journey. They were following a pillar of fire through the wilderness. And then in another era, we talk about the Babylonian captivity, a whole sort of generation of Judean elites in the 6th century before Christ being taken to Babylon. We hear about the Babylonian exile. And so much of Christian identity grows out of that exile experience. Jesus lived an itinerant lifestyle. The gospel says he had nowhere to lay his head. So for me, one of the ways to combat the isolation is to remember, wait a minute, we're all on a journey. We're all on a journey of constant change toward a destination which people of faith sort of identify as the hereafter. But it's a journey nevertheless for all of us. And I think all of us know implicitly, at least intellectually, that life is constantly dynamic. Things are constantly changing. But we also like our normal, the places that we call normal, the places that we're used to. To a certain extent, that idea of arriving somewhere, of normality, of things always staying the same, it's a little bit of denial. So when I feel most discouraged, and from time to time I do, and Kathy does, I know all of you do, I remember that I'm on a journey, that I take God with me wherever I go. If my principal belief system is an ethical system, a system based on treating people well, irrespective of religious belief, there is no setting in which I cannot do that work. Even if I'm in the hospital, even if I'm coming to the end of my days, I have visited patients who think this way. I can be curious about the people around me. I can own my agency of hope and optimism by opening myself to the people wherever I may find them. And if I'm stuck at home, in my room or my apartment, as so many of us are now, I find a way to use technology to connect and reach out. There's always a way that we can reach out and connect. And remember, we're all on a journey together. Even in isolation, even in quarantine, we are journeying through the wilderness. We're conscious of being exiled from the places where we like to be and are looking to recover that unity and find a way to be agents of the unity ourselves by recognizing the power we have to connect with our neighbor.
I agree with that wilderness statement wholeheartedly. And also that people are trying to find a way to connect. I know we encourage people who don't have the knowledge of technology to call people frequently. And that is always a big help. But there is a difference between being on the technology, although it does provide some intimacy, but also there's a difference between being physically with that person or with your family. And I wonder how we all need to redirect and rethink and be very creative. I know some people writing letters. We haven't written letters in a long time, but that's also a very intimate, wonderful way to connect. So I keep wondering how we can experience that intimacy, which, as you mentioned, that we are all meant to have, that connectedness with one another we're meant to have. I keep wondering how we can make it do better with that.
Well, knowing a little bit of your ministry, Celeste, and of the ministry that Rick and Brian and others do at ECS, I know that you and our residents at our ECS family of homes are like our church leaders around our 5.5 county diocese, doing the best they can to do exactly what you've described. Come up with creative ways to be in touch and to combat the enemy of isolation. But here is the thing that I think it's important for us to own, because we all of us are in one way or another creatures of a modern society that tries to provide as much comfort as it can, to try to hold mortality at bay. This again takes me back to a conversation I had this morning with my spouse, Kathy. On the wall beside me, you see a montage of pictures of one of our 2 granddaughters. And this is something I imagine that folks listening may be able to relate to in a powerful way. The sense of separation that Kathy is experiencing from her 2 grandchildren. One of them on the verge of 3, the other now well on the way to 1.5. Everybody knows how rich relationships are with children at that age, at any age, but particularly at that age. And what I experience in her is a sense of mourning at the loss of time together. That no number of FaceTime calls or Zoom conversations or talks on the phone can make up for, because the physical presence and the need for the physical connection, particularly between parents and children, grandparents and great-grandparents with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, there is nothing that substitutes for that. And so all of us are in grieving and mourning about precious incarnational time lost. Now, we might look forward to the opportunity when we can make up for lost time, and I know we all will. Those of us who maybe take for granted those relationships, which sometimes people do because their lives are busy and full of distraction, we now will have incentive to understand the blessing of those relationships. But we have, all of us, lost time. I think there's probably going to be 100 doctoral dissertations. I speak, Dr. Buttress is finishing up or has finished her doctorate. I imagine some doctoral dissertations will be written about what happened in the lives of preschool-age children when this kind of moment of socialization was interrupted and they began spending far more time than they would have otherwise with their parental units. Now, there may be some blessings to that, but then you look at the impact on parents, many of them working at home and now actually figuring out how to be classroom aides during
Yes.
school, and also keep the kids entertained over summer while they're trying to do their vocations. So there's a trauma that's coming from that. And then there's the trauma that's experienced by those of us who are physically separated from those whom we love. And we have to, the first step to recognizing the power of an exile, wilderness-based approach is to remember that we are in exile. And we are in the wilderness, and there are human and emotional and spiritual costs to that. And in order to address those costs, we have to be kind to ourselves. We have to understand that maybe we don't have quite as much patience with the situations in which we find ourselves as we're used to having. Maybe it's easier to get our goat and push our buttons. I know I experience that sometimes. We can't be in denial about what we're losing. Once we've owned that and understand that we're hurting, we can then kind of brush the dust off our feet, as Jesus famously said. What am I going to do to make the most of this situation? Not so much to feel sorry for myself, but to take the sense of empathy I've developed from understanding how I am hurting by being cut off, by reaching out to someone and helping them deal with their isolation. That ends up being the essential jump for people of faith and people with a kind of a mature, kind of ethical consciousness. Okay, I don't like what I'm having to deal with. How can I be an agent of making somebody else feel better as a consequence of my heightened empathy?
Definitely. Now, you mentioned about hurting, and I agree. I think we're all hurting, and we all are suffering that loss. What are you doing for self-care, may I ask?
Well, I'm giving myself permission to read whatever I want. I'm a somewhat guilt and shame motivated person, and I should be reading Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton, because Hamilton is much in the news now because Disney now is beginning to broadcast the play. But instead, I'm reading my way through Michael Connelly's Harry Bosch novels, because they're good, distracting detective stories. And they're not necessarily teaching me much, although they're teaching me a little bit about the ins and outs of the greater Los Angeles area, because these are good Los Angeles stories. The other thing I'm doing is being attentive about my prayer life and talking to God as much as I can, both in the form of sort of formal spirituality and prayer, using what Celeste and others from the Christian experience and I call the daily office, which is a sort of cycle of morning, noon, dinner time, and nighttime prayer. I'm going to invite Celeste and Sharon to distribute to the ECS community a YouTube page called That Deacon on YouTube. One of Celeste's deacon colleagues, the Reverend Anthony Keller, has an online ministry of Compline, which is prayer at the end of day. And they're short, beautiful liturgies to watch. They're obviously going to be more appealing to those of a Christian background than others, but Anthony makes them general enough and open enough that there might even be some comfort that those who aren't Christians or even people of faith might find just in the beauty of the videos and the music and of the words. And I'll provide that a link to my ECS colleagues so they can pass it along to you. But then there's also the prayer in every moment. And this is something that those of a monastic bent and those of us for whom personal spirituality becomes a preoccupation try to get our eyes around it, and our hearts around, the eyes of our hearts, I should say, to quote the gospel. And that's this notion that in every single moment, God is present. There's something holy, sacred, sacramental, but every moment that creatures of God find themselves in. This is the essence of a faith life. I don't have to go to church, and right now I can't go to church in order to talk to my my Creator and be comforted. And it's a theological proposition, and it's not one that's necessarily going to be meaningful to everyone. But my particular theology, and I know what Celeste's and others as well, is that the fundamental component of the universe is love. That the universe was created in love, that we are saved in and by love, and that we're always bathed in love. And if every moment is like a church service, if every moment is an opportunity for prayer, my spouse can walk in when I'm busy, and I can either choose to stop what I'm doing, close my computer, stand up, smile at her, and I can say, "How are you?" Or I can say, "Can I come find you in 10 minutes? I'm in the middle of something." You see, there's two choices there. And every moment, there's a series of choices. And for people sort of on this wilderness exile walk, where resources are scarce, tempers are sometimes short, a consciousness of what we have lost and what we are missing is ever present. We have those moments in which, in spite of all that, we can extend ourselves in love whenever and wherever possible. And the short answer is that it's always possible. And I used to preach all the time about how if we don't talk to the person in front of us or behind us at Starbucks, they look like strangers, but they're actually not. They're just members of our family whom we haven't met yet. And whenever we have those conversations, if it's in our nature to have them, some of us being more outgoing and gregarious than others, every time we have one of those conversations, we almost always learn something. We're almost always blessed. We're almost always surprised and inspired. We're not in Starbucks right now, and yet there are people around us, if not right in front of us, within reach. And what's happening certainly in our churches right now is that as people rely less on sort of pleasantries at coffee hour. After church, we have coffee hour. Well, how are you, Celeste? Oh, I'm fine. Good to see you. Did you have a good week? Yes, I had a very good week. Thank you very much. Nice to see you. I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. Sometimes we have coffee hour conversations like that. But we're missing that. We're feeling the loss and we're injured by it. And so we get on the phone and it's, Celeste, we've never had a chance to talk in any detail. Where did you go to high school? Can you tell, who was the first president you ever voted for? What's the first presidential election you remember? What sport do you miss the most? Those sorts of sort of almost journalistic, inquisitive conversations where we permit ourselves to exercise our natural curiosity about one another. It's an act of compensating intentionally for the loss of relationship coming from human contact that we used to take for granted. We never will again. By the grace of God, we will never take it for granted again. But now I find myself hungry for whatever conversation I can get along the way.
I like the fact that you brought up intentionality, because I do believe in this wilderness desert that we find ourselves, that it is teaching us intentionality. And it's also teaching us from what, as you say, the family, that we're all the same family. And it's teaching us that we are all love, we are all family, and maybe making ourselves more vulnerable to that other so that we can find our commonality and rejoice in our differences. And I have found that in community, our communities coming together and with more understanding of the diversity of culture, the diversity of faith, or spirituality, or non-spirituality and non-faith. But I agree wholeheartedly. We have to keep that intentionality and be very kind to ourselves. I like your self-care, because you can't keep up the intensity all the time. We really can't. We cannot keep up the intensity, and we have to do something just because it's fun.
So Celeste, what do you do for self-care? As involved as you are on a daily basis with your ministry, what are your tips for taking care of Celeste?
Well, Celeste likes to meditate. And when I don't take the time, I really feel it within myself. And meditation is just so everywhere. Everywhere is mindfulness and meditation. And so I have to say that I do take the time to do that. I take the time to watch comic movies. I take the time to talk to a couple of people who I'm very close to, and reach out to those who I'm becoming close to. And I just relish the time sometimes by myself. I reach out to my children, and I too have grandchildren that I speak with just about every day. And I still have a child at home, he's gonna be 20. And I think I'm more intentional in reaching out to him and taking whatever opportunity we see. Now, the Zoom meetings, which although is not ideal, the best, it's there. And I think that all of those things, the deacons have a community, and I have a community of friends. And all of those things come together to, I think, create more spirituality and more grace in the moment than some can really realize. And it takes looking at that all the time to find that grace. So self-care, I like to read, I like science fiction, and we take whatever opportunity we can. As you said, and in the wilderness, in the desert, there's a thirst for that, absolutely. But it's all about love. So that's what I do, and that's how I hold my heart to all I meet.
Celeste, I'm so glad to hear you talk to our people about meditative practice. And one of the reasons why I think that's a suitable subject for us to spend just a little extra time on is that there's this whole new way of doing meditation and doing mindfulness from a purely secular, non-religious perspective. Those such as Celeste, and I count myself among them, although while I love to meditate and always find myself enriched and comforted by it, I confess that I don't devote as much time to it as I probably ought to. Because as Celeste suggests, 20 to 30 minutes spent in silent contemplation, using the techniques available to us of quieting the mind through the repetition of a word, a phrase, or a prayer, giving yourself permission to be distracted, smiling at the distraction, continuing the repetition until finally the distractions begin to recede and leave us alone. Those of you who've meditated know what that feels like. And that moment comes when you're just present with yourself and with the world. And if it is your particular belief, your creator. And those are incredibly restful moments, and those techniques are available to us whether we're faithful or not. The other thing that Celeste referred to, which is so important, is the diversity of the human family. If we believe in the Abrahamic canon, we all came from Mesopotamia. We all came from modern day Iraq, which is more or less where the Bible suggests the Garden of Eden was. If our approach is entirely anthropological and scientific, we came from a few hundred square miles in sub-Saharan Africa. That's where it all began. One community of people who began to migrate and move and have different kinds of experiences, and based on the weather and based on other things about the diversity of our globe, we all came from the same place. And this pandemic has given us the opportunity to look anew at some of the persistent inequities in our society. And we all know that when you look at essential workers, more of them are Black and brown than other categories of workers. And as a consequence of that, higher rates of infection and COVID-19 death as a consequence of that. Some of us get to do our work completely socially isolated on Apple laptops, but not all of us. The inequities that have fallen on older Americans as a consequence of their being sort of isolated in ways that I think we have a responsibility now to address. The murder of George Floyd is something which has galvanized our society and caused us to have the opportunity in our enforced leisure, maybe to listen to some voices calling for change that we might have not had as much time to pay attention to before. This is the miraculousness of the way the Spirit leads us. And polls are showing that most Americans now understand that there's a considerable amount of work we can still do when it comes to inequities rooted in race. And so we have this moment when circumstances isolate us. But what we're seeing on television, what we see in our ethical systems and our faith systems calls us to deeper unity and community. And I will say this at the risk of sounding a little bit like a fire and brimstone preacher. But if there is a devil, if there is Satan, they come to us in isolation. Isolation to me is the ultimate enemy. Loneliness, neglect, the isolation that comes from having been the victim of trauma, the isolation of shame, the isolation of addiction, the isolation of oppression, however people are isolated. There is darkness there. And it is our responsibility, wherever the circumstance finds us, to be agents of the light. And if we are feeling isolated and we don't like how that feels, and if our circumstances permit us to be agents of the light, then we battle against the isolation. We battle against the darkness. We shine our light in the darkness because it is in us for as long as we breathe. There is some light that we can shine. And what we recognize is that that's might have been why we were created. Certainly what Celeste and I believe. This is why we were made, to shine this light. And someone who decides that their system is purely an ethical one, we also know those virtues have to do with light. They have to do with justice and compassion and being fair to all. And as my favorite fictional detective Harry Bosch says, the value that everybody counts or nobody counts. So if there's somebody out there who's not being counted, who's being left in isolation, who's being isolated or marginalized, and we've got some work to do for the glory of God and the sake of humanity.
And you're bringing up a very good point. Everyone has those things within us that we don't want others to see and that we don't want to bring to our thoughts too. And the isolation does cause that. And as you say, and I'm going to assume you're saying also, because I have a feeling that's true, the forgiveness that we can feel by coming together and just bringing love to one another, which is really what we do and what we're called to do. helps bring that light in.
Celeste, why is forgiveness so important?
Why is forgiveness important?
Yeah.
Because we are created, however you believe creation to be, in love. And when we feel that isolation and feel that darkness within ourselves, we are not open to that love. And forgiveness brings that. And if we are created in love, everyone deserves forgiveness. Everyone deserves respect without judgment.
Right.
Our actions can say something else, but that is how we are meant to be, and that's how we are created. And that's where our grace is, especially for me, that's where the grace and spiritual growth comes from, in isolation or in any despair that may bubble its surface in my life. And we need to remember that.
So was the Lord's Prayer, which is of course a Christian expression, although it was offered by someone who was by his own people called a Jewish rabbi. The Lord's Prayer says, depending on the translation, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, or forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. It's as though Celeste suggests, that if we wish to experience the forgiveness and acceptance that is ours, thanks to the promise of the author of love, the author of our creation, offers us forgiveness, then we have to find a way to practice forgiveness. And any group of 100 people you get together, this is again, if Celeste and I were in the pulpit, we'd be talking about this. And we'd say, now, my sisters and brothers, my siblings, you're all sitting there in your Sunday best, but you know and I know that right now, I say right now, there's someone in your life, who could use a little bit of forgiveness. There's somebody who forgot your birthday, or someone who broke a promise, or someone who is now long past, who did you wrong and they're gone. But you've never forgiven them. You've never just sat in a quiet place and said, Ernie, I forgive you. But that ends up getting back to what Celeste said about intentionality. Sometimes we've got to use the time we have while we're going through the process of owning what we've lost, and understanding the trauma of isolation. Maybe do a little bit of that forgiveness work, and just let some stuff go. There's some stuff that happens in public life, as is always is the case. No matter who's in or who's out, they're making somebody mad. And so when I find myself mad, say at politicians, if it's somebody who isn't listening to me, which it almost always is, and someone who isn't going to change, no matter how many posts I leave on Facebook, or no matter how much I might try to make some adherent of that person feel bad about it. You know how we do that? There might be President Smith in there, and President Smith isn't listening, but your mother-in-law insists on voting for President Smith, and so I'm going to yell at her about it. Well, why am I going to disrupt my relationship with my mother-in-law over something that neither of us can actually do anything about, pro or con? And so sometimes in politics, we have the opportunity to forgive those whom we don't agree with, and understand that maybe in most cases the relationship is more important than the issue. So whatever our anger, sense of loss, sense of having been aired against is, we might lighten our own load a little bit. We might stop carrying quite so heavy a cross, as a Christian would say. We let some of that stuff go. So I'm very grateful for the deacon for raising this theme of forgiveness, which is a vital one as we continue to make our wilderness exile walk together.
But forgiveness also, if someone has been a victim of violence, forgiveness allows the victim to not be a victim any longer. Yeah. And I think that is just so important to remember, that we forgive because we don't want to be controlled by those horrible things that we may have experienced in our lives.
And we don't begin to think about forgiveness until we're out of danger. I don't think either Celeste or I or any of your chaplains would say to anyone who is enduring a trauma that forgiveness has to occur before, justice, reconciliation, reparation, and first of all, safety. Forgiveness is something we do for the sake of lightening our own load, not to in any way, as Celeste suggests, justify or excuse an injustice.
There's a lot to be learned in our time of isolation, and a lot to be learned and reflect upon in our journey through the wilderness. How do we open our hearts to all of these things and find the guidance, hope, and strength? I wonder how we do that to keep going at this time. And
this is such a rich question, Celeste. And to know for sure, we'd have to sit with everyone who's listening to us and do some work, the kind of work that spiritual direction does for us. And you begin with an exchange of narrative. What's your walk been like? Where'd you grow up? What were the sources of love for you? Who were you able to depend on? Was there something in your life that taught you actually couldn't depend on anyone except yourself? This is not to turn everything into the psychiatrist's interrogation. It is to recognize that we are formed from a variety of threads, one of which is our family of origin and our earliest experiences, and the extent to which love was reliable. And I know this because I've had to do this work in my own life, to work through my own experiences, my own sadnesses and my own joys, in order to be able to do the kind of work that Celeste and Brian and Rick and others do. We own our narratives because we're creatures of our narratives, Celeste and I, and we minister out of our narratives. And so this is going to be the same with everyone. It is a Christian proposition that hope is eternal. It's a faith proposition that the darkness will never overcome the light, as John's gospel, the fourth gospel, asserts. But it's not everyone's experience, because many of us have experienced darkness in the absence of hope. So what happens is that the faith practitioner will sometimes fall back on canards and shibboleths and easy expressions, when in fact, we can't know for sure until we've heard your story, until you've taught us out of your experience. Because remember, it's always mutual. The best relationships are always give and take, teaching one another, sacrificing for one another, learning from one another. That's why I have a kind of a high conception of the relationship compared to the issue. It's less important to me who somebody votes for than what their story is and why they've decided to vote, because I can learn from that. Because this is a proposition which I hold out in spite of all the pessimism and darkness in the world. And it was taught to me by the former executive director at our diocesan Camp Stevens, Beth Bajarski, who said to me once on the phone that her whole philosophy was based on the proposition that most people are doing the best they can. And that often people don't hold obnoxious points of view or do obnoxious things to make my day worse. But because those actions and beliefs are a consequence of their worldview and their experience. And it's my responsibility to learn from that and listen to that person and find a way to keep the relationship lively so I can keep learning. And there's not a lot in our culture and politics which is inviting us to that kind of mutuality. But it's in the nature of the wilderness exile walk, not to judge the brother, the sister, sibling walking at your side, because we're all of us stuck in this wilderness walk. We're all making the journey. The fact is they're there, and I'm here, and we're all going to the same place.
Absolutely. So where is your heart right now, Bishop Taylor?
Well, my heart is wishing I could be in the presence of everyone hearing our words. As I always say and feel at the end of any opportunity to be with folks whom just recently I was able to be with personally, and thanks to Susan and Sharon and others at ECS, and a shout out first of all, or not first of all, but certainly to our colleague James Rothrock, who is the gentle and gracious and wise shepherd of the whole kit and caboodle. I've had the opportunity to be at several of our installations, and I look forward to coming back again. And so I feel like saying what my old boss Richard Nixon said on his last day in the White House. He didn't say farewell, goodbye. He said au revoir. Mm-hmm. We will meet again. And that might be the essence of the hope. When we put the phone down after another telephone conversation with a grandchild we haven't seen in 3.5 months, we will see you again. We will be together again. That's what's in my heart.
I'm hearing a lot of hope and a lot of resilience and a lot of love there. And I also have to say many thanks to all of Episcopal communities and services, because they are just so committed to the body, mind, and spirit of not only the residents, but the employees and all who are and families. And I want to take that opportunity. I never pass up an opportunity to say thank you. Amen. And I thank you, Bishop Taylor, for sharing and your openness and giving us all something to think about in our reflections.
Thank you, Deacon. I've so enjoyed our conversation. Bless your ministry, and please give my blessings and love to your colleagues, Rick and Brian, and all of our friends at ECS.
Absolutely. And I think I'll be talking to you soon. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.